Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, you've brought us a really interconnected set of global developments. The evolving situation in the Ukraine conflict, especially reports out of Kursk, the continued push now from Secretary of State Rubio on NATO defense spending, and these just announced U.S. tariffs impacting, well, a lot of nations.
Yeah.
Our mission, as always, is to cut through the noise, extract the key insights for you.
It's quite a snapshot, isn't it? You've got this localized conflict seemingly tied to these broader alliance dynamics,
Right.
which are then playing out against these big shifts in trade policy. It really makes you think how these pieces all, influence each other.
Absolutely. So we're sifting through Reuters, Russian war bloggers on Kursk, statements from Rubio in Brussels on NATO, and then all sorts of news and official responses on these new tariffs.
Okay.
So where do we start? Let's dive into Ukraine first, specifically around Kursk. It sounds like things are getting pretty intense there.
Indeed. Based on the info you shared, it looks like the Ukrainian-controlled area within Kursk is shrinking. The reports really focus on those three villages near the Sumy border: Gornal, Guevo, and Oleshnya.
Yeah.
Clearly major fighting zones.
And Gornal. There are some really intriguing, though, unverified details coming out. Russian war bloggers are claiming, over 300 Ukrainian soldiers might be sheltering in that Gornalsky St. Nicholas Belogorsky monastery.
Mm-hmm.
And here's where it gets really wild. They're suggesting underground passages for supplies, maybe even evacuation.
Wow.
It paints a pretty dramatic picture, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It raises questions about the tactics involved here, if those claims about the monastery are true.
Right.
It highlights the complexities of fighting in, built-up areas and using civilian structures. We also see the MASH channel, which, has links to Russian security, emphasizing Ukrainian efforts to defend the higher ground around Gornal. Holding high ground, classic defensive move, right?
Right, crucial. And the strategic implications seem pretty significant. The sources suggest if Guevo and Gornal fall, Russia could have a much clearer path toward Sumy.
Yeah.
We even saw Kyiv's top general warning about increased Russian attacks on that northeastern border, and Ukraine trying to keep some kind of security buffer inside Kursk. Sounds very fluid, very challenging for them there.
That's a key point. While Ukraine is obviously focused on defending in Kursk, the info also points to reported Russian advances elsewhere further east and south. Geolocated images from early April seem to confirm Russian flags in places like Oleksandropil near Tariffs, plus gains in Lysivka, Bodanivka, Berlatska, Lobkov.
So multiple spots.
Exactly. It suggests this broader Russian strategy, applying pressure along different axes, maybe trying to stretch Ukraine's resources thin.
And there was that one reported Ukrainian advance southeast of Kotlin near Pokrovsk.
Yes.
But like the material says, it seems pretty isolated compared to the Russian gains elsewhere. It really underscores that idea. Russia pushing on many fronts at once.
Yeah, definitely seems like the strategy.
Okay, so shifting focus now to NATO. We're seeing the U.S. again, urging allies to spend more on defense, but this time, they're floating a much higher number.
Yes, the pressure seems to be ramping up. Now it's Secretary Rubio in Brussels saying the U.S. expects NATO members to aim for 5% of their GDP on defense.
5%. That's a substantial increase from the current 2% target.
It really is. And while, the info says 23 out of 32 members did meet or beat that 2% target last year,
which is progress.
it is, but you still have major players like Italy and Spain lagging quite a bit, around 1.5%, 1.3% respectively. So even hitting the current goal is still tough for some.
Right.
What's interesting about Rubio's message, though, is the nuance. He apparently acknowledged that hitting 5% immediately isn't realistic for most, but stressed the need for a real commitment, a clear path towards boosting that spending over time. It's about signaling a long-term shift, stronger collective defense.
And here's a fascinating bit. Rubio apparently said this applies to the U.S. too. Yeah, suggesting maybe the U.S. is willing to increase its own defense budget, maybe leading by example, or just reinforcing the call for allies to contribute more.
Interesting. And connecting this back to Ukraine, you see how that conflict feeds right into these NATO spending debates.
Absolutely.
There are clearly underlying worries in Europe about, U.S. reliability long term, especially given past rhetoric. Maybe a perceived U.S. pivot away from Europe.
Right, the America First echoes.
Exactly. And NATO's always been the cornerstone against threats like Russia, so any hint of weakened U.S. commitment is a huge concern.
And you add in Trump's past comments about Moscow, the pressure on Kyiv.
Yeah.
It understandably creates unease. especially for countries bordering Russia.
For sure.
They need those solid assurances on Article 5, collective defense. It really highlights how interconnected everything is.
It certainly does. Makes you wonder about NATO's future trajectory, how these burden-sharing talks will actually play out. The U.S. clearly wants Europe to shoulder more responsibility.
Okay, let's pivot to the third big piece. These new U.S. tariffs announced by Trump. They seem to have really shaken things up globally.
Indeed. Announcing tariffs on imports from around 200 countries, that's a huge move. And what jumps out immediately, like the sources say, is how, well, inconsistent or almost arbitrary the rates seem.
Yeah.
You've got this flat 10% on places like Egypt, UAE, Brazil, Ethiopia, but then Cambodia gets hit with 49%, Algeria 59%. It's hard to see a clear single economic reason for those specific numbers.
It really is puzzling. And Brazil, that case is particularly striking when you look at the actual trade figures.
Right.
They get the 10% tariff, same as allies like the UK, Australia, which seems maybe moderate.
Yeah.
But the U.S. has a massive trade surplus, with Brazil third largest globally.
Exactly.
We're talking $7 billion surplus in goods in 2024, jumps to like $28.6 billion, including services. Over 15 years, the cumulative U.S. surplus is around $410 billion.
So the usual justification for tariffs restoring balance, reciprocity, it just doesn't fit the Brazil situation at all.
Not even close.
It makes you think, are there other motives? Geopolitics, domestic politics, something else?
And the data just throws up more weird examples. Montserrat, 26%, Madagascar, 47%, Myanmar, 44%. The numbers just seem plucked out of thin air sometimes.
Yeah, not clearly linked to trade deficits or unfair practices in any consistent way.
And then on top of that, there's the extra 25% tariff on imported vehicles.
Right. Primarily hitting Mexico and Canada, who kind of oddly weren't on that main list of 200 countries.
Wow.
The stated goal is obvious: protect the U.S. auto industry.
But even that seems complicated. Companies like Tesla, relying on imported parts, they'll face higher costs, right? Elon Musk is reportedly against these tariffs.
Which is notable, yeah.
It just shows how tangled global supply chains are. You try to protect one bit, you can end up hurting another, even a domestic one.
Precisely. Ripple effects.
Brazil's official response from Itamaraty, the foreign ministry, was pretty strong.
Understand.
They regretted it, said it violates WTO commitments, and basically is out to fight back. Mentioned maybe going to the WTO, maybe using their own economic reciprocity bill. They clearly feel wronged, especially with that huge trade imbalance favoring the U.S.
Yeah, you can see why. And looking broader, this move is definitely adding volatility to global markets. Other leaders are criticizing it.
Right.
The sources are right to frame this as potentially marking a big shift away from the trade liberalization era, GT47, WTO, mid-90s. Seems more protectionist now.
And the political reaction inside the U.S. is interesting, too, crossing party lines a bit. Schumer, a Democrat, questioned the logic why 54% on China, 10% on Iran, but 0 on Russia, implying it lacks strategic sense. Or maybe it's political. Booker mentioned Republicans joining Democrats to push back on potential Canada tariffs.
Yeah, that suggests real disagreement within the U.S. political system about whether this is smart policy.
We even saw Rand Paul, a Republican, make that dramatic comparison to Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the 30s.
Oh.
And their role in the Great Depression. That's a pretty stark warning about the risks of trade wars.
It is a serious historical parallel to draw. And the immediate market reaction stocks down globally, dollar hitting a 6-month low that definitely shows the financial world is nervous.
So for you, our listener, digesting all this, the big question is this tariff strategy actually effective for the U.S. economy and its global standing? Or is it a risky move with potentially damaging consequences economically and politically? And that puzzle remains. Why those specific, wildly different tariff rates, China versus Iran versus Russia? It's still unclear.
It also just shakes confidence in the predictability of trade rules, which businesses really rely on.
Right. So to wrap it up, the key takeaways. We've got the concerning situation in Kursk, Russia seemingly gaining ground, the renewed U.S. push for much higher NATO spending, 5% GDP target now, and these sweeping, seemingly arbitrary U.S. tariffs hitting even partners like Brazil, where the U.S. has a big surplus.
And thinking about how these things connect the war, straining alliances, trade policy shifts impacting those alliances, it leads to a final thought for you to consider. What are the long-term consequences for global stability and the economic order, especially when we see such different approaches applied to different nations across these critical areas?
Definitely a lot to mull over.
For sure. It paints a picture of a world in, well, considerable flux.